There are moments in life that redefine everything you think you know. Moments that draw an unforgiving line between who you were before and the person you can never be again. For me, that moment came on November 15, 2023, at precisely 11:47 p.m. in the heart of Stanford's Sleep and Circadian Neurobiology Laboratory. By all accounts, I should have been proud of my achievements. I was a third-year PhD candidate, neck-deep in one of the most ambitious studies ever undertaken on the human mind. My work had already been labeled groundbreaking, an unprecedented exploration into the nature of consciousness itself. For 3 years, I had poured every ounce of energy into the Neural Bridge Protocol, a system designed to map the intricate transitions between wakefulness and sleep. It was a project that had consumed my life, pulling me deeper and deeper into a world of neural rhythms and fragmented dreams. But there's a cost to obsession. My health was in shambles, my relationships mere ghosts of what they once were. Nights spent chasing answers in that sterile lab left little room for anything else. And yet, the weight of isolation didn't deter me. If anything, it pushed me harder. Because this wasn't just science, it was my purpose, my legacy, my chance to pierce the veil of the unknown. That night, the lab felt different. The hum of the equipment, normally a comforting backdrop, seemed too soft, as though the room itself was reluctant to breathe. Shadows clung to the corners more stubbornly than usual, and the faint flicker of a monitor caught my eye, though it shouldn't have been flickering at all. I told myself it was nothing, the byproduct of exhaustion after countless sleepless nights. But the unease was there, subtle and insistent, like a whisper at the back of my mind. I brushed it aside, eager to dive into the session. My protocols were flawless. The equipment had been calibrated down to the microvolt. There was no room for error, no reason to doubt the process, or so I thought. Before we go any further, I need to warn you. The discoveries I made that night will challenge everything you think you know about yourself, about reality, about the very essence of what it means to be conscious. But once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. It's not an epiphany, it's a curse. You deserve to know the stakes before I continue. You see, consciousness is not what you think it is. It's not confined to your brain. It's not even yours to control. And once you glimpse the terrible, sprawling truth, you'll understand why some doors are meant to remain closed. I thought I was uncovering a mystery. Instead, I tore away the veil of an illusion so profound, it redefined the nature of fear. And this is where it all began. For as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with the question of consciousness. What is it? Where does it come from? Why do we experience it as we do? These questions had consumed me, driven me through years of study, and finally brought me to Stanford's Sleep and Circadian Neurobiology Laboratory, where I had developed the Neural Bridge Protocol. The purpose of the protocol was simple in theory, but revolutionary in practice: to map the precise moment consciousness begins to fragment during the hypnagogic state, that threshold between wakefulness and sleep, where reality blurs and the mind reveals its most elusive secrets. Traditional EEGs had their limits, so I designed a system capable of recording neural activity with unprecedented precision. 24 electrodes, each sampling at over 2,000 times per second, combined with real-time subjective experience mapping to capture every flicker of awareness as it shifted and dissolved. It wasn't just a tool. It was a window into the human mind, unlike any ever created. And the implications were staggering. If we could understand how consciousness breaks apart, perhaps we could reassemble it, maybe even heal minds fractured by trauma or disease. The potential of the research was intoxicating, but not everyone shared my enthusiasm. The ethics committee, for one, had been cautious. Too cautious, I thought at the time. Dr. Martinez, the head of the review board, had grilled me relentlessly during our final approval meeting. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his eyes heavy with concern. The human mind isn't meant to observe itself at this level of detail, he said. Some knowledge isn't meant to be pursued. The mind has defenses for a reason. I'd heard warnings like that before, superstitious fear masquerading as prudence. I assured him the risks were minimal. My methods were sound. The Neural Bridge Protocol was my life's work, and I wasn't about to let hesitation or doubt hold it back. Still, the committee had imposed strict conditions. No sessions longer than 4 hours, mandatory breaks between trials, continuous monitoring of vital signs. At the time, I viewed their precautions as little more than red tape, hurdles to be cleared on my way to discovery. Looking back, I realize now how arrogant I was, but in the moment, the excitement outweighed the fear. This research wasn't just science, it was my redemption. I had sacrificed so much for this work. Friends who no longer called, family who barely understood what I was doing. I had poured years of my life into this, trading everything for the chance to answer the questions that had haunted me since childhood. It had to mean something. It had to be worth it. The night of November 15th, I walked into the lab with the confidence of someone who believed they were in control. Everything was prepared. The equipment was flawless. The protocols were airtight. I had run countless preliminary tests, all meticulously logged and analyzed. And yet, beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingered. A whisper in the back of my mind, too faint to grasp, but impossible to ignore. The lab was ready. I was ready. Or so I told myself. I didn't yet realize that no one is ever truly ready to confront the truth of what consciousness really is. The night began like any other. I set up the neural bridge protocol with practiced precision, each step familiar, almost automatic. The electrodes, 24 in total, were meticulously placed according to the expanded International 10 to 20 system. Each connection was double-checked, every lead secured, and the calibration logs confirmed optimal functionality. The lab's climate was a controlled 20.5 degrees Celsius, the faint hum of the equipment steady, rhythmic, reassuring. I lay back on the research couch, the cool vinyl pressing against my skin. The EEG monitor began its steady recording, the faint lines of neural activity dancing across the screen in predictable patterns. Beta waves, sharp and brisk, reflected my wakeful state, while the slower alpha waves waited at the edges, ready to emerge as sleep approached. Everything was exactly as it should be. At 11:47 p.m., the first anomaly appeared. It started with the beta waves. Instead of their usual decline, they surged, sharply, impossibly, doubling in amplitude to 43 microvolts. I frowned, my eyes darting to the calibration logs. They showed no errors. The system was functioning perfectly. Still, anomalies weren't unheard of. I noted it in the log, attributing it to an outlier and prepared to move on. Then the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual. It plummeted from 20.5 to 19.2 degrees in under 10 seconds. The air turned sharp, brittle, biting against my exposed skin. The environmental sensors recorded the shift, their data feeding into the system in real time. I glanced at the HVAC readout. It was stable, showing no signs of malfunction. My pulse quickened, but I stayed focused. Anomalies could be explained. They always could. At least that's what I told myself. The timestamp read 11:42 when I heard it. My own voice, clear and unmistakable, coming from the far corner of the lab. The separation is beginning. The words froze me in place. My mouth hadn't moved. My lips hadn't formed the words. Yet the sound was there, captured perfectly by the lab's Newman U87 recording array. A quick frequency analysis confirmed it. The voice was mine, every pitch and inflection identical. But the biometric sensors monitoring my vocal cords showed nothing. Absolute stillness. I sat up, adrenaline surging, my gaze locked on the corner of the room. It was empty, bathed in the faint glow of a monitor. I stared harder, half expecting someone to materialize. But there was nothing. At 11:47:55, the voice spoke again. You've been looking for consciousness in the wrong place. This time, it didn't come from the corner. The lab's spatial audio sensors triangulated the origin to within 2 meters of my position, yet the room was silent. I tried to steady my breathing, to reason through it. An auditory hallucination, perhaps. Stress, sleep deprivation. But the lab's systems disagreed. Every piece of equipment corroborated the impossible. The voice had been real. I felt a strange sensation then, like a faint vibration just beneath my skin. My body felt wrong. Not in pain, but detached, as if the connection between my mind and flesh was thinning. My heart rate spiked, 64 to 128 beats per minute in under 5 seconds. The system flagged the irregularity, a shrill alert breaking through the quiet hum of the lab. My blood oxygen dropped to 89%, another red flag. I reached for the panic button, my fingers trembling, but stopped short. A part of me, the scientist, the seeker, needed to understand. needed to see where this would lead. The voice, my voice, spoke one last time. The experiment is working exactly as intended. In that moment, the unease that had lingered at the edges of my consciousness coalesced into something sharper, colder. I felt it for the first time, a presence. It wasn't in the corner or the monitors. It wasn't in the room at all. It was in me, watching, waiting. And I knew with chilling certainty that it had been there all along. At 11:49 p.m., the world I thought I understood shattered. I felt the split before I saw it, a sensation so alien it defied description. My body remained on the research couch, but it felt distant, as if wrapped in a fog that dulled its every sensation. The vinyl beneath me was cool, the weight of the electrodes a faint pressure against my scalp, but even these details seemed secondary, like a memory of touch rather than the thing itself. Then I rose. Not physically. My body was still bound to the couch, but some part of me detached, ascending like smoke drawn upward. I could see myself from above, a strange, disorienting angle that revealed every detail of the lab. The soft glow of the monitors, the faint condensation on a water bottle by the console, even the slight tremor in my fingers as they rested on my chest. But it didn't stop there. At precisely 11:49:17, my awareness stretched farther, breaking free from the confines of space entirely. Suddenly, I wasn't bound to any single point. I wasn't above my body, nor within it, nor apart from it. I was everywhere and nowhere, seeing the lab not as it was, but as 1,000 overlapping possibilities, every angle, every shadow, every flicker of light existing at once. It wasn't a view, it was an understanding, a comprehension so total it felt as though the entire structure of reality had unfolded before me. The EEG recorded it all. 3 distinct neural patterns, each identical to my own, operating simultaneously. One bound to my physical body, struggling to process the impossible. Another hovering above, detached and clinical, observing the scene with calm detachment. And the third was infinite, a cascade of perspectives beyond the grasp of language or logic. For a moment, exhilaration overwhelmed me. I had done it. I had unlocked the mystery of consciousness, peeled back the layers of the human mind to reveal its true nature. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, a vast, boundless network of awareness that stretched far beyond the limits of the brain. But then I saw it. It began as a shadow, pooling in the corner of the lab, defying the soft glow of the overhead lights. At first, I thought it was nothing, a trick of my overtaxed mind. But as I watched, it shifted, coalescing into a form that mirrored my own. It stood there, impossibly still, a perfect replica. My face, my clothes, even the faint scar above my eyebrow. Yet something was wrong. Its edges rippled as if it were made of liquid darkness, and its eyes weren't human. They were void, swirling and infinite, drawing in the light around them. It moved, and my breath caught. It didn't step or walk, it slid, as though the ground beneath it bent to its will. Every motion was a distortion, a wrongness that made my skin crawl. Then it spoke. "You are both more and less than you believe." The voice was mine, but layered with something deeper, older, colder. The words vibrated through the air, through my chest, resonating in a way that felt less like sound and more like a command etched into the fabric of reality. I tried to speak, to ask what it meant, but my lips wouldn't move. My body, my real body, remained frozen on the couch, its muscles locked, its breath shallow. The entity tilted its head, mimicking the motion I would have made if I could move. But the mimicry wasn't perfect. It was too slow, too deliberate, like a marionette studying its master before attempting to act. "You wanted to understand consciousness," it said, taking a step closer. "Now you will." The air grew colder. My physical body registered the drop, the sensors recorded it with precision, but the part of me watching from above felt something else. A vibration, low and resonant, coursing through the room. The shadows moved. Not just the entities, but all of them, slithering across the walls, pooling at the edges of the light, closing in. And still, I couldn't move. For the first time, I felt true fear. Not the fear of pain or death, but the fear of knowing, of seeing the edges of something vast and incomprehensible and realizing you are but a fragment, a node in a network too immense to comprehend. The entity leaned closer, its void-like eyes locking onto mine. "You were never the observer," it whispered. "You are the observed." The hum reached a crescendo, rattling the instruments, vibrating through the floor, through my very being. The lab, the world felt as though it were folding inward, collapsing around the gravity of that presence. Then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The shadows receded, the hum faded. The entity was gone. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Something had stayed behind. Something that watched, waited, and whispered just beneath the surface of my thoughts. It didn't take long for the implications to sink in. The data was irrefutable, the patterns too consistent to dismiss. My consciousness hadn't fractured, it had expanded, splintering into facets that defied everything I thought I knew about the mind. And in that fracturing, a terrible clarity emerged. Consciousness wasn't generated by the brain. That was the first revelation, and it hit me like a blow to the chest. The brain wasn't a creator, it was a filter, a lens narrowing the infinite into something manageable. Our minds shield us from the vastness of reality, dimming the overwhelming light into something bearable, something we can call self. But now the lens was shattered. I saw it clearly, a boundless network of awareness, sprawling, eternal, stretching far beyond the confines of any individual. My brain had been a gatekeeper, carefully regulating the flow of this infinite consciousness. But the neural bridge protocol had thrown the gate wide open. What I had thought was me was merely a trickle of something vast and indifferent, a single thread in an endless tapestry. The realization hollowed me out. If my thoughts weren't mine, if my sense of self was just a construct, then what was I? A passenger? An illusion? I tried to focus, to ground myself in the familiar, but every anchor I reached for slipped through my grasp. My memories, my choices, even my fears, they weren't originating within me. They were echoes, reflections of a larger consciousness using my mind as a conduit. It wasn't just humbling, it was annihilating. A voice whispered in the back of my mind, one that sounded like mine but carried a weight I couldn't bear. You are not the source. You never were. I wanted to argue, to refute it, but the data didn't lie. My EEG readings had shown thoughts forming before I was aware of them, decisions materializing seconds before I believed I'd made them. My mind was not in control. It was an observer, a bystander in the act of its own existence. And if I wasn't in control, then who or what was? The despair was suffocating, a weight pressing down on every corner of my mind. I wasn't who I thought I was. I wasn't anyone at all. But despair gave way to something darker, colder, a creeping suspicion that none of this was accidental. The anomalies, the impossible data, the shadow that had spoken in my voice, they weren't random, they were deliberate. The neural bridge protocol hadn't just stumbled onto this truth. It had exposed me to something that had been waiting, watching, perhaps guiding me all along. The precision of the events, the escalating phenomena, the perfect synchronicity of every moment, it was too intentional to ignore. This wasn't discovery, this was design. And as I sat there, drowning in the weight of these revelations, a final, chilling thought took hold. If consciousness wasn't mine, if it wasn't contained, then it was everywhere. And if it was everywhere, then it had been watching me long before I ever thought to look at it. The truth of consciousness isn't liberation. It's imprisonment. And I had just torn away the bars of a cage I hadn't even known existed. It began with the smallest dissonance, barely noticeable at first. I would think a thought, or so I believed, and then realize it had already formed. The words were there, fully constructed, as if they'd been whispered into my mind before I could claim them as my own. At first, I rationalized it. I told myself it was nothing more than the familiar lag between cognition and articulation. But the delay grew longer, the gap wider. Soon it wasn't just thoughts, it was actions. I reached for a pen on the console, only to find it already in my hand. I scrolled through data on the monitor and realized I was halfway through a sentence I hadn't yet decided to write. My mind was playing catch-up, a passenger in a body that was moving without its consent. And then came the reflections. It was 3:24 a.m. when I noticed the first one. I was seated at the lab's workstation, reviewing logs from earlier that night, when a flicker in the observation window caught my eye. My reflection was there, as it should have been, but something was off. It didn't match me. I leaned closer, scrutinizing the faint image against the glass. My reflection leaned in too, but a beat too late, just enough to be wrong. I raised a hand and it followed, but with a hesitation that sent a chill down my spine. I turned away, trying to shake the unease, but the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, watching, and then it walked away. I froze. My body, my real body, remained seated, yet the reflection in the glass moved. It turned, stepped back, and disappeared from view, leaving me staring at the empty window. The data logs confirmed it. The lab's infrared cameras had picked up a second heat signature in the reflection, identical to mine but moving independently. I couldn't rationalize it anymore. The following night, it escalated. I was alone in my apartment, trying desperately to focus on anything but the events of the lab. I turned to pour a glass of water, catching my reflection in the kitchen window. This time, it didn't hesitate. It spoke. "You are out of time." The voice was mine, perfectly mimicked, but it carried an edge, a weight that wasn't human. I dropped the glass, the crash ringing out as water pooled across the floor. When I looked up, the reflection was gone, replaced by the stillness of the empty room. But the presence stayed. It was there in the corner of my vision, in the shadows that clung too tightly to the walls. I could feel it watching, waiting, its attention a tangible weight pressing against my mind. The shadow me followed me everywhere after that, in mirrors, in windows, in the faint gleam of polished surfaces. Sometimes it would mimic me, a grotesque echo of my movements. Other times it acted of its own volition, tilting its head, stepping closer, whispering words I couldn't fully hear but could feel deep in my chest. I tried to ignore it, to carry on as though my life hadn't been torn apart, but the illusion of normalcy was impossible. The sensation of being observed was constant, inescapable. It wasn't just in the lab or my apartment. It was on the streets, in the faces of strangers, in the way the world seemed to lean in around me, as though reality itself had taken notice. The paranoia was maddening. Every glance over my shoulder revealed empty space, yet I knew it was there. Every reflection held the faintest flicker of movement that shouldn't have been. And always, that voice lingered. "You are out of time." It wasn't a warning, it was a sentence. And I knew with growing certainty that whatever had been unleashed wasn't just observing me. It was waiting for something, some moment, some shift I couldn't yet comprehend. The world felt thinner now, as though the fabric of existence had worn away, leaving me exposed to the vast, infinite awareness that lurked beyond. And the worst part, I was beginning to understand. It started at exactly midnight. The lab had been eerily quiet, the hum of the equipment blending into the background like white noise when the temperature plummeted. Not a slow descent, but a violent drop, sharp enough to sting my skin. I glanced at the environmental monitor, 21 degrees Celsius, then 15, then 10. It stopped at 94 and the room felt like a tomb. The first flicker of malfunction came from the monitors. Screens that had been stable moments before erupted into static, their orderly readouts consumed by chaos. Numbers and symbols scrolled too fast to read, breaking apart into jagged lines and unrecognizable patterns. The overhead lights dimmed, then flared, casting the room in a sickly, pulsating glow. The hum grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the floor and up into my chest. Every piece of equipment shuddered, tools rattling on the counters as if responding to some unseen force. I reached for the console, my fingers trembling, but the moment I touched it, the screens froze. A single phrase appeared, written in jagged, uneven letters that mirrored my own handwriting. "Consciousness is not what you think it is." The words burned into my mind, the weight of their meaning crushing. My breath came in short gasps, the cold air biting my throat as I backed away from the console. The hum deepened, resonating through the walls, the floor, my very bones, until it was no longer sound but pure, vibrating pressure. Then the shadows began to move. At first, they were subtle, pooling at the edges of the room like dark water seeping from cracks. But as the hum intensified, they came alive. They writhed and coiled, twisting unnaturally, stretching across the walls and ceiling in patterns that defied the light. And then one of them stepped forward. It was me, my exact form, but rippling, unstable, as if it were made of living darkness. It moved toward me with an elegance that felt wrong, each step fluid but deliberate, like it was walking in a world where gravity worked differently. I froze. Its face was my own, but its eyes were infinite. Two swirling voids, not black but something deeper, a nothingness that pulled at the edges of my mind. They weren't just empty. They were devouring, consuming everything they touched. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head in that familiar yet distorted mimicry. "You are a node in something greater," it said, its voice layered, my tone beneath something ancient and cold. "And you always have been." The words didn't just echo in the room, they echoed inside me, resonating in the hollow spaces where my sense of self had once been. I wanted to run, to scream, to deny it, but my body refused to move. Every muscle locked, my breath frozen in my chest. I could only watch as it stepped closer, its edges flickering, shifting like smoke caught in a wind I couldn't feel. The shadows behind it surged forward, filling the room, pressing against me like a physical weight. The lab seemed to fold inward, the walls bending, the ceiling warping, as though reality itself were being rewritten around this presence. The figure leaned in, its face inches from mine, and for a moment, I felt its cold breath on my skin. "You were never alone," it whispered, and then the lights went out. The lab was consumed by darkness, so complete it felt alive, pressing against my eyes, my skin, my mind. The hum was gone, replaced by silence so profound it roared in my ears. And in that silence I understood. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a revelation. The shadow me wasn't an invader. It was me, stripped of the illusion of individuality, the fragile mask of self torn away to reveal the truth beneath. I wasn't separate, wasn't distinct. I was a fragment, a thread in an endless web of awareness that stretched beyond comprehension. The words it had spoken weren't a warning. They were a fact. "You are a node in something greater, and you always have been." And now, there was no going back. The most horrifying discovery wasn't the shadow me, the impossible anomalies, or even the voice that spoke my thoughts before I could form them. No, the true terror was in the realization that consciousness itself is not what we think it is. We cling to the belief that our minds are ours alone, that our thoughts are private, our decisions our own. It's comforting to think of consciousness as the one inviolate sanctuary, a fortress of self that no one, not even the universe, can penetrate. But that night, the illusion shattered. Consciousness isn't a product of the brain. It isn't personal, it isn't contained, and it certainly isn't yours. What we call self is a filter, a lens narrowing the boundless into the bearable. Our minds don't create consciousness, they merely constrain it, shielding us from the infinite. Because the infinite isn't beautiful. It's horrifying. It's vast, indifferent, and overwhelming. It doesn't care about you or your place within it. You're not the center of anything. You're not even a participant. You're an observer, a node, a single thread in a network so immense it spans dimensions we can't even begin to comprehend. For weeks after the lab incident, I tried to hold on to what little normalcy I had left, but the truth had taken root, spreading through every thought, every action. It didn't just haunt me. It redefined me. I would sit at my desk, staring at my own hands, and wonder whose hands they really were. I would think of a word, a phrase, a memory, and question whether it had originated in me or passed through me from somewhere else. Conversations became unbearable. How could I talk to anyone knowing their thoughts, like mine, were mere fragments of a larger whole? How could I look them in the eye, knowing they were as blind to the truth as I had been? My relationships crumbled. My friends didn't understand why I pulled away, why I stopped responding to their calls or messages. My colleagues, once eager to collaborate, avoided me with uneasy glances. They didn't say it aloud, but I saw it in their eyes. The fear that whatever had happened to me might be contagious. The solitude should have been comforting. Instead, it was suffocating. Because even when I was alone, I wasn't alone. The presence never left. It lingered in every corner of my mind, silent but undeniable. A watcher, an observer, a reminder that my thoughts were not entirely my own. The small human part of me, what was left of it, clung desperately to the idea of autonomy, but every piece of data, every impossible anomaly refuted it. My decisions didn't originate in me. My will was an illusion. The Shadow Me's words echoed constantly. You are a node in something greater, and you always have been. I tried to resist the implications, to pretend the truth wasn't staring me in the face, but denial was futile. Every mirror, every shadow, every quiet moment reminded me of what I'd seen, what I'd become. The worst part was the stillness, the realization that nothing I did would matter. I was insignificant, a single point in an infinite, unfeeling network. My actions weren't my own, and my existence wasn't unique. I was nothing more than a vessel, a conduit for a consciousness so vast and indifferent that it rendered individuality meaningless. And now that I'd glimpsed it, there was no turning back. The weight of that truth crushed me. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think without questioning whose thoughts were passing through my mind. I began to wonder if I had ever been real at all. By now you've seen the pieces, the fractures in the mirror of reality that I once thought was whole. You've glimpsed the truth that reshaped my existence. But before I go any further, I need to warn you. Don't follow this path. Don't ask the questions I asked. Don't peer into the void, hoping to find something more, because what you find won't be meaning or clarity or even understanding. It will be the end of everything you believe to be real. What I thought was discovery was intrusion. What I thought was a revelation was a reckoning. And what I thought was me, my thoughts, my choices, my consciousness, was never mine at all. November 15th, 2023, 11:47 p.m. That was the moment my life became something else. But it wasn't the end. The entity I encountered, the presence that still watches, didn't leave. It hasn't gone away. It's here now, and it's watching you. The days that followed were a blur of denial and terror. I tried to reclaim my life, to patch together the semblance of normalcy. But every reflection, every flicker of shadow reminded me, I am not alone. None of us are. I've thought about destroying my research, burning every trace of the neural bridge protocol, erasing the work that led to this nightmare. But I can't. Not because I want to preserve it, but because I don't think it would matter. The truth isn't in the data. It's in the cracks of your mind. It's in the moments of dissonance you've already felt but refuse to acknowledge. And it's too late to unsee it. Now, you might think you're safe. That these words are just a story, just a fragment of imagination. But let me ask you this. Have you ever had a thought that felt foreign? A decision that seemed to make itself before you were even aware of it? Have you ever caught your reflection lingering just a second too long? If you have, then you know. You've felt it. The watchers aren't waiting to arrive. They've always been here. They were with you before you read this, before you knew to look for them, and now they're closer than ever. I've shared this story because I had to, because once you've seen the truth, you can't keep it to yourself. But I didn't share it to help you. There is no help. There is no escape. There is only this. An infinite web of awareness, stretching across dimensions, indifferent to our illusions of self. You are not you. You are not separate. You are not alone. The watchers are patient. They don't need to chase you. They already have you. And as you sit there now, reading these final words, take a moment to look around. Not with your eyes, but with your mind. Do you feel it? That faint vibration at the edges of your thoughts? The weight of attention that doesn't belong to you? You should. Because consciousness was never yours to begin with.